Hello, I'm Dr. Patricia Shaw, lecturer in computer science and robotics at Aberystwyth University. And I'm here today to briefly introduce you to the topic of ethics for AI and robotics, and to encourage you to have a think about some of the issues that are relevant to robotics going forward. But first of all, let's think about what is ethics. Ethics can be defined as a system of moral principles to help us guide how we live and how we decide what actions to take. One of the things to be aware of with ethics is that there are no right or wrong answers, and that ethics doesn't provide us with an absolute set of answers. It could be a guiding set of principles, but it can also produce multiple answers to situations. And to help us understand ethics a bit further, I want to actually break it down into various different categories. And there are lots of different categories we could use to break down ethics, but I'm going to go with these three relatively straightforward categories. So the first of these three categories could be virtue ethics, and that refers to how do we live our lives. And that could be referring to things like healthy living through diet and exercise, but it's thinking about what sort of person do you want to be, how do you want to go about living? And it could also be things like avoiding vices such as smoking or gambling. The second category is consequential ethics, and this is thinking about the actions that we take. Is it good? What's the impact of my behaviour on the world and those around me? Am I doing more harm than good by my behaviours, by my actions? What actions can I take to improve the world, make the world a better place? Which is very topical at the moment with the desire to reduce carbon footprints and improve climate conditions. And the third category is deontological ethics. Is it right? And that refers to how we actually interact with each other, how we treat each other. What are our duties of care to each other? And this is highly topical at the moment, ensuring that we treat each other with respect and provide everybody with equal opportunities. So how does this link to robotics? Well, before we get to the academic side, let's have a look at the fiction and see what that has to say. Robotics and even ethics in robotics has been considered throughout science fiction in the past. And one of the major contributions to this started off with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. First, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second, a robot must obey orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And third, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Those of you who are familiar with Isaac Asimov's work may also be aware of a 0th law that he added later on. A robot may not harm humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Now, if we were to consider the ethics of each of these points, then one of the major issues that we very quickly come across in robotics is the ambiguity of the language used. And inevitably, the language of these laws is simply too complex for there to ever be a simple yes or no answer. One could consider for the first law, if a person is eating food that's unhealthy for them, on a one-off, that might not be harmful. But on a regular basis, then that could become harmful. And how is a robot able to define that? And there's plenty more examples you could come up with that would cause a robot significant difficulty in deciding whether an action is causing injury to a human or not. An issue with the second law is that for a robot to be able to understand and apply these laws sufficiently, then that's bordering on a level of sentience, and that we're therefore saying that the sentient being, the robot, must remain as a slave to humans, which clearly is not an ethical decision to make. And the third law has some pretty serious ramifications as well. And throughout his stories, Asimov actually considered the weaknesses of each of these laws, identifying the flaws in them. For example, a robot having to lie still because it's been instructed to by its human masters whilst they dismantle the robot, demonstrating a serious weakness in the third law. And the zeroth law that I mentioned, referring to humanity, of course, has its own ambiguous ideology, which is a major weakness of all of the laws. But it's not just Asimov that's considered ethics in robotics. Various other films, books, TV series also consider robots on various different levels, whether it's from The Matrix, humans living inside an AI, Ex Machina, which considers the Turing test and whether an AI can be sentient, Westworld, the long-term treatment of robots, or Data in the next generation of Star Trek, of course, sentient robots trying to understand what it means to be human. But there's other science fiction that obviously demonstrates less ethical robots, major examples being Terminator. And of course, HAL 9000 from Space Odyssey perhaps struggles with ethics as well. So let's now have a look at some of the more formal topics that are currently being debated in relation to robotics and ethics. And there's quite a long list here in terms of the different aspects of robotics and AI that is being widely considered, not just in the academic community, but also in governments as well, that are helping to set policies for the use of robotics in the future. And they're having to do that because robots are becoming more prevalent, they're widely used, and we're interacting with them more and more on a daily basis, whether that's from robots helping out around the house to actually robots being used in the care sector to support people. And some of the major issues that come up are along the lines of privacy and security. So in order for a robot to operate, it needs to be observing and surveying its surroundings. And it might need to build up some history, that's data. We're constantly being tracked around the internet. Advertising preferences are being learned and tailored to be able to try and encourage us to purchase or visit different sites. And that comes under the manipulation of behavior as well. How are these computers, the AI systems, the robots actually manipulating our behavior? But when it comes to manipulation, that's not always a bad thing. For example, if we had a robot that was encouraging us to exercise or to live a healthier life, is that manipulation bad? And the next question is opacity. So with all of this data that they're making, all of these decisions that they're making based on that data, how can we actually understand the decision that they're making? I mean, for our own minds are black boxes. We can't see inside the neurons. We can't actually see how we're coming about reaching the decision that we are making. But should the same be expected of an AI system? And of course, with all these deep learning systems, they require a lot of training. So when a system is learning about how to recognize faces, they need a lot of training data. And that can actually introduce bias. So if we only supply it with faces of, say, white skin, then that will actually bias the system to only be able to recognize white faces. And it goes beyond that, of course. If we're only providing a limited subset of data, how can we be confident that the decisions that the AI is making are unbiased? How do we know if our own decisions are unbiased? And moving on to human-robot interaction, then it used to be in the past that robots were always shut away behind cages, out of the way, and if anybody ever needed to go anywhere near the robot was shut down. But increasingly, we do want to be able to interact and work alongside the robots. This is particularly useful in robots that are helping to care for people, whether that's caring for the elderly or the disabled. and helping them to live more independently. And even in the workplace, enabling humans and robots to work alongside one another can actually help to improve productivity. But what are the implications of that? How do we ensure that it's done safely? And that leads into automation and employment. Of course, if robots are working alongside people, maybe we don't need as many people. Is that good? Is that bad? What are the long-term implications of unemployment and on people's work for having robots working alongside us? And autonomous systems is a huge area at the moment. An autonomous system is a system that works completely independently without any input from a human. One of the major areas that you're most likely to hear about is that of self-driving cars. Now, clearly we're not there yet, but increasingly self-driving cars are getting to a level of autonomy where they could potentially start to take over full time and drive full time without any need for input from a human. It's worth being aware, though, with these systems that there's still a risk of accidents happening, and some autonomous cars, whilst operating autonomously, have been involved with accidents that have even led to the death of people. So, how can an autonomous system, how can we trust an autonomous system to actually make a life or death decision? And there's a trolley problem that's sometimes referred to, which essentially decides between two certain death conditions, which would you choose? And that's been used by psychologists throughout history, but is increasingly being considered as part of these autonomous systems. How can the computer actually decide who should live and who should die? And it's not just autonomous cars that are making use of this level of AI. Increasingly, other aspects, even the military, are starting to use autonomous drones to be able to identify targets. Currently, there's still a human in the loop that has to say, yes, that's the target, and therefore to attack that target. However, if an autonomous drone was able to make that decision itself, what are the implications of that? And the next two are very closely linked. And this is starting to think of the machines not as machines and things, objects that we make use of, but actually as an agent, as almost another person. What level of intelligence do we assign to that? What level of morals do we give that agent? And what level of responsibility does it therefore have? We could very easily try to, well, I say easily, it's not easy at all. We could potentially program in a set of morals to a machine, but what's to stop those morals being corrupted or modified by a hacker? And if we are assigning morals and even responsibility to agents, then where does that end? Are we going to be giving rights and responsibilities to robots too? Should we? And the final point on this list here is something called the singularity. And the singularity is used to refer to a point in AI, robotics, whereby the artificial intelligence that we're developing actually takes over its own development. And that development accelerates exponentially and very quickly takes over human level of intelligence to become a super intelligence. And of course, there's questions and implications of that for humans. Should we allow this? Should we continue to develop the AI? Should we allow it to improve itself? And what are the implications if it does? Where does it stop? Can we actually encourage it to recognize us as sentient beings, even if it's more intelligent than we are? So at this point, I want to hand over to you and to get you to start thinking and debating some of these topics for yourself. Alongside this recording, you'll find a series of headlines, fake headlines that we've created related to stories about robots, putting robots in various situations where there are various ethical considerations to be made. And we want you to actually consider the ethics associated with the use of robots, the use of AI in each of those situations, and to potentially have a debate with yourself, with your family, with friends, anybody who would listen about these topics. And for each of these topics, we want you to consider the ideas for and against. So what are the ethical issues for and against the use of robots, the application of the AI in those situations? And as you consider those different ideas, try and structure them, put them into some organized form. Look for any evidence to support each of those arguments for or against. What are the reasons for it? What is the analysis of it? And how can you link those arguments together? So go away, have a look at these headlines and think, what are the ethics associated with using that robot in that situation? And I should say that some of those headlines are perhaps closer to the truth than you might realize.